For all of us who have been working hard to dismantle oppressive systems, promote honesty and transparency in the midst of chaos and a thousand lies, and for all of us who have been trying to create a future where peace and justice is possible, let's take a moment to enjoy the announcement on Saturday that Donald Trump lost his bid for re-election. But savoring that moment, I should let you know that this will not be a celebration sermon, but a continued call to action. So if you need a little more time to savor and enjoy and celebrate, you might just press pause for the moment and come back when you're ready to get back to the work. Last week, Roger gave an impassioned plea for us to treat each other civilly, to take the high road and not give in to the urge to be petty when our cause is so great. And in the spirit of honoring that aspiration as long as possible, he planned to go away on the weekend after the election and asked me to preach instead. So I'm going to do my best to be honest without being cruel. But I don't want that to be misconstrued. This week's election revealed again that the United States is still swimming in some very dangerous waters. Because this presidential election, it should not even have been close. After an outrageous 2016 campaign when Trump clearly showed us who he was, followed by 4 years of brutal, vindictive, delusional cruelty as president, Donald Trump should have lost by a landslide. And that he did not says more about the people who live in the United States than it does about Donald Trump. But it does say something about Trump, and that's a good place to begin. Jason Stanley, a philosophy professor at Yale and author of 2018's How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, described Trump in this way. He says, "I'm not saying that Trump is a fascist. Trump is certainly performing fascism. It's the tropes of fascism, and I think that that's worrisome enough. What's to stop him from escalating? What's to stop a future person, a future president from escalating, whether Democrat or Republican? There are already existing structures. Our prison system is an already existing structure that's sort of ravenous for prisoners, for bodies. Trump is showing how you can use existing structures in fascist ways if you so desire. He might be doing it merely performatively. We don't know. But you want to stop it early so you don't allow this performative fascism to be something that could be turned non-performative and degrade our democratic norms. But instead of showing a collective will to put an end to performative fascism, half of the voting public of the United States demonstrated that they will, at the very least, tolerate it. And in many millions of cases, they will even celebrate it. Put another way, we wanted this election to be a landslide defeat of Donald Trump because we wanted it to be a referendum on democracy, on saying no to the continued slide toward fascism, and that did not happen. Stanley went on to say that the USA's long habit of leaving our social problems unsolved and unaddressed leaves us continually vulnerable to demagogic politicians and fascist forces. He said, we have these fascist forces. We have our prison system. We have these enormous budgets for our police. We have an enormous military budget. We have all these returning Iraq war veterans. We had a war on terror that gave us a Department of Homeland Security. They are tools that someone can pick up and push further. What we need to do is remove the fascist forces. We need to address our prison system, address our over-policing problem, address our inequality, cut down the insider dealing between corporate elites and the government, and then we won't get people who can do this kind of thing. That sounds like a pretty easy ask, right? Who wouldn't want to do that? Who wouldn't want to bring an end to the possibility of fascism rearing its head again and again? That said, I have to confess that I personally doubted that the election would be a landslide because I don't have confidence in the people who had to make that choice. And yes, I'm talking about and to fellow white people. It's no secret that the white majority is in decline. According to the Brookings Institute, white people made up almost 80% of the U.S. population just 40 years ago. And recent data shows that number to be roughly 60% today. And a growing percentage of that number is older and rural. By last year, 27 of the USA's largest cities had minority white populations, and more than 50% of the nation's children, under 16 years old, identified as a racial or ethnic minority for the first time in our nation's history. And while much has been made of the uptick of racial and ethnic minorities voting for Trump, don't be distracted from the essential role of white people. We can clear this up by taking some lessons from the New York Times exit polls that were released Tuesday. White voters still made up 65% of voters, and 57% of them voted for Donald Trump. And despite Trump's well-established reputation as a misogynist, 55% of white women still voted for him. And while white people aged 45 to 59 voted for Trump at the highest rate, 60%, more than half of the white people in every voting age group voted for Donald Trump. The lowest rate was for white people aged 18 to 29, and 51% of them, according to the exit polls, still voted for Donald Trump. No other racial or ethnic group voted for Trump at near these levels or numbers. The next highest rate was Latinos over 60 years old. 39% of them voted for Trump, but they make up only 2% of the voting population. If you want to understand why white people voted this way, you don't have to look far. We can go back to those same exit polls. The Times asked respondents to tell them which issues mattered most in deciding how you voted for the president. And priorities became very clear very quickly. For Trump voters, the key issues were the economy, especially related to COVID-19, and crime and safety. And that latter phrase is very important because if you've paid attention to Donald Trump, you know that talking about crime, and more specifically talking about law and order, is how Donald Trump talks about race in the United States. The issue of racism and white supremacy was, unsurprisingly then, one of the biggest and probably the most important differences between those who voted for Trump and those who did not. Of the 26% of voters who called racism a minor problem or not a problem at all, 82% of them voted for Trump. Conversely, of the 71% of voters who correctly noted that addressing racism in the USA should be a top priority, 70% voted for Joe Biden. Similarly, of the respondents who said that the criminal justice system treats all people fairly, 83% supported Donald Trump. However, of the respondents who correctly noted that the criminal justice system treats black people unfairly, 81% of them voted for Biden. My phrasing here is deliberate. That racism is still rampant in the United States, and that the criminal justice system disproportionately targets and punishes racial and ethnic minorities are established facts. There isn't anything to debate here. Unfortunately, we can see a pattern among Americans on the whole, but especially Trump supporters, of rejecting reality. As another example, 31% of respondents said that climate change was not a serious problem, and 84% of those folks voted for Donald Trump. And of voters who viewed wearing a mask in public as a personal choice rather than a public health responsibility and a vital part of our efforts to slow the pandemic and prevent unnecessary suffering, 72% voted for Donald Trump. This is all part of performative fascism. It twists everything around. White supremacists aren't viewed as a problem, but people protesting racism are the objects of fear, hatred, and even violence. Climate change isn't acknowledged as real, even in the face of the increased natural disasters, wildfires, and diseases that follow in climate change's wake. Instead, we're told that all of this is a plot to damage the economy and get Donald Trump out of office and usher in a totalitarian regime. What this all amounts to is the increasing normalization of white nationalism. This election turned out to be a referendum on how socially acceptable it was to tolerate and promote white nationalism and performative fascism from the highest office in the United States. And more than half of white people voted that they approved. This is important because the threats are not imagined. The risks are very real. By now, you've all heard about the way a Trump train of about 100 vehicles tried to run a Biden-Harris campaign bus off the road in Texas earlier this week. Driving mainly pickup trucks covered in Trump campaign flags, they shouted profanities at and eventually even blocked the Biden campaign bus. Later, the Biden campaign had to cancel an event scheduled for Austin to be on the safe side. In response to hearing about all that and seeing the video, Donald Trump tweeted, "I love Texas," all capital letters. If a collection of right-wing extremists trying to run the campaign bus of an establishment candidate off the road isn't a symbol of the current state of American society and politics, then I don't know what is. Unfortunately, since the election, the threats continue to escalate. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon used his online platform to announce that Dr. Anthony Fauci and FBI Director Christopher Wray should be beheaded as, quote, a warning to federal bureaucrats. He went on to say, quote, "I'd actually like to go back to the old times of Tudor England. I'd put the heads on pikes, right? I'd put them at the two corners of the White House as a warning to federal bureaucrats. You either get with the program or you're gone. Time to stop playing games," end quote. And Scott Walden, a police captain in Alabama, is now under investigation for a Facebook comment that insisted, quote, "They need to line up every Biden voter and put a bullet in their head, in their skull for treason." This should be shocking. Instead, it's a sad commentary on the state of our society that we've become almost unsurprised. But words matter. And this isn't empty rhetoric. Violent hate crimes in the United States have continued to rise, and domestic terrorism continues to be an increased risk. In fact, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project and Militia Watch assessed that Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Oregon had a high risk for activity and violence by armed extremists before and after Tuesday's election. And North Carolina, Texas, Virginia, California, and New Mexico were at moderate risk. They identified threats from both individuals and from groups such as the 3 Percenters, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Lightfoot Militia, Civilian Defense Force, American Contingency, Patriot Prayer, excuse me, I'm not used to saying this word, Boogaloo Boys, and People's Rights. You know, these are not the types of actions and warnings that characterize a healthy, functioning society. That said, I know that most of the white people who voted for Trump, at least the ones I'm familiar with, would likely disagree with that assessment. I know because I've had so many conversations with them, with white people who insisted that racism just isn't a problem, that we've moved past all of that. They insist that white supremacy, it went away with slavery. If I press them, they'll admit, yes, it was still a problem with Jim Crow. And if I press just a little more, they'll admit, yes, even segregation was pretty bad. But the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement, they say, they insist it fixed all of that. Now they tell me the only reason that white nationalism and racism is a problem, the only reason I can read to you a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 prominent groups that have arisen promoting white nationalism. The only reason those things exist is because we keep talking about race and racism. They insist that if we would just shut up, there wouldn't be a problem. They don't understand that this kind of deflection has been the weapon of white people to avoid the work of dismantling racism at every stage of history. Please, fellow white people, we have got to do the work. If I sound a little desperate, when I ask this. It's because we're staring at a long history of white people's refusal to dismantle a system of privilege and power that benefits us at the cost of the well-being of fellow human beings and the earth itself. We've been having this very same conversation and doing this work as humans for hundreds of years with limited results. For example, in preparing to speak today, I went back and read the words I offered 4 years ago on the weekend that Trump won that election. Then, as today, Roger was away, leaving me increasingly suspicious that the post-election sermon responsibility might be some kind of hazing for associate ministers that I don't know about. But I went back to what I had written, and I found those words to be still relevant. I hope it's not considered poor form to quote myself, because I really think it holds up. 4 years ago, I said this: that human history is overflowing with injustice is one of the most bewildering and difficult realities for people to face with honesty, especially by those who benefit from that oppression and exploitation. That oppression is a price that we've been all too willing to see paid as long as someone else was doing the paying. It's the price that has been paid by a planet squeezed to death by our insatiable, ignorant greed. Yet we have proved again and again, and I'm especially talking to white people here, that we would rather not be honest about the ideas and actions that have led to this point and that sustain systems that are overwhelmingly and obviously unjust. As long as there is profit to be made or power to be grabbed, as long as our conveniences and adoring self-views are more important than justice, as long as we feel helpless in the face of it all, there will be easy reasons to excuse, justify, or hide our complicity. When I look back at those words, they feel even more poignant when we consider another result from the Times exit polls. 41% of voters Tuesday said that they were better off financially during the Trump administration, and 72% of them voted for Donald Trump. In other words, the perception of their own financial gain justified indifference for the well-being of others. Perhaps this is true of most people, but it certainly applies to us white folk. When we think things are going well enough for us, we step away from the struggle. And this brings us to a more difficult point. There's reason that all these existing structures that Stanley was talking about in the beginning of my talk today, that all these existing structures have been so easily used in fascist ways and turned against the well-being of the people they were ostensibly designed to protect. The hard truth is that the United States of America was birthed in oppression, and those in power have long relied on polarizing its population in order to more easily accumulate wealth and power. The world we inherited after 4 years of Donald Trump as president, guess what? It is consistent with the world we lived in before the Trump administration. Again, if you'll tolerate me quoting myself from 4 years ago, I said this: the current global economic system came into existence on the bones and backs of millions upon millions of human beings through the tragedies of genocide, slavery, and colonialism, and the ruthless extraction and use of natural resources without consideration for disastrous ecological impacts on natural and human communities. The current global economic system is maintained through the continued exploitation of billions of human beings working, living, and dying under oppressive, dangerous, and economically unjust conditions, and the continued ruthless extraction and use of natural resources with little consideration for the impacts. For those who are pushed to the margins, crushed under the glittery boot of capitalist expansion, the meaning of life is reduced to survival. For those outside of power, but within the circle of privilege, the meaning of life is reduced to consumption. We sustain it with the choices we make when we shop, invest, and spend our time. The earth and everything and everyone on it is reduced to a potential source of profit, and we are reduced to a pool of data that can predict what we are most likely to buy and when. So, I'll be honest with you. In my experience as a queer working class person who is also working to unlearn and dismantle white supremacy while living in Southwest Missouri, the lives of oppressed people here generally did get worse during the Trump administration. But they did not generally get worse in new ways. These last 4 years have indeed been overflowing with suffering and cruelty, and marginalized communities have suffered the most. But for many of us, these last 4 years represented a difference of degree. We already lived in a world that was not designed for us or our well-being. And this is why you'll hear us emphasizing the importance of organizing, of building community, and developing networks of mutual aid, while simultaneously working to heal from internalized oppression, unlearn internalized dominance, and dismantle white supremacy in ourselves and our organizations. People who belong to communities that are typically dehumanized, exploited, and then quietly disposed of, such as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, gender and sexuality minorities, and disabled folks, have been doing this work for decades and decades, across generations. Why? Because there has never been a federal or state government that was genuinely interested and committed to equality and justice for oppressed people. This didn't start with Donald Trump, and it won't end with Joe Biden. It arrived here in the oppressive minds and hearts and cultures and systems that colonizers brought to the Americas. And it still lives in the minds and hearts and cultures of our neighbors. And yes, our government officials. And yes, sometimes ourselves. And that's also why you'll keep finding us fighting, no matter who wins what election. These elections are clearly important. But I think we also realize that voting was never going to be enough. Voting has never been enough. No matter what the final count in this election, the work is always going to include dismantling white supremacy, fighting corruption, and creating safe, accessible, inclusive, just communities. The work didn't begin with an election, and it will not end with an election. Our movements have always had a larger vision. We understand that we need each other to share the work, to take breaks, to learn from one another, and to care for each other. And we stand in a long line of people who have been doing this work, inheriting their courage, their grace, their determination, their love, and passing it on to the next generation. So we will keep insisting on creating a society where all of us, where all the people can finally thrive. That said, our collective movements do impact elections, and we celebrate that. For starters, we celebrate Vice President Kamala Harris and all the firsts that she represents. We celebrate Cori Bush, Missouri's first Black Congresswoman. We celebrate Mauree Turner, Oklahoma's first Muslim legislator and the USA's first non-binary legislator. We celebrate Richie Torres, the first openly gay Afro-Latino congressperson. We celebrate Deb Haaland, Yvette Harrell, and Teresa Ledger Fernandez in New Mexico's election of 3 women of color to the U.S. House of Representatives. We celebrate Sarah McBride, Delaware's first openly transgender elected official and the USA's first openly transgender state senator. We celebrate Taylor Small, Vermont's first transgender state legislator. We celebrate Stephanie Byers' election to the Kansas legislature, the first transgender Native American to be elected to office. And we celebrate the incredible community organizing that's been going on in Georgia, including Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight, the New Georgia Project, Black Voters Matter, Georgia People's Agenda, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, among many. 4 years ago, I stood in a pulpit and challenged us to keep insisting on justice and peace, to live up to our commitment, to not stand idly by, and more than that, to actively create a society where everyone's voice could be heard and everyone's needs could be met. It's hard work, and the violence, coercion, and exploitation we face is exhausting. But you know what? It's also joyful work. And we have proved again that the work can be done. And we have a lot to celebrate. It's also urgent work. And we are gratefully coming to an end of the Trump administration. But this work is just as important as ever. Unless we put an end to the vulnerabilities in our society that leave an opening for fascism, we're likely to face an even more cruel and terrifying future. So I'll close with one more quote from my words from 4 years ago. Because the work remains, and we must do the work. I said, how we work for what we love is something we discover together. There is so much being done already, and we may find our place in these movements or find ourselves in the midst of something new. But the first step is to begin reflecting and acting right now so that wisdom has a chance to start her work. We must announce the way things could be as insistently as we condemn the way things are, with all its injustice. We must dream of a future and reimagine a society where people live peacefully with each other and the earth, our health bound up together. We must remember to work for what we love with even more enthusiasm than we expose that which we fear. So, today, let's pause and take a breath. Take the time you need to grieve what's happened these last 4 years. Take the time we need to celebrate what's ahead and the possibilities. And then let's rededicate ourselves to creating a future where kindness and compassion, where justice and wisdom are not only possible, but real. Let's get back to work. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.